bound wrist to gatepost. Maribel Cole was barely breathing when a stranger's knife found the rope, the same day that would change his life, and hers, forever. 5 other women hung beside her, dresses torn and fluttering in a wind that carried nothing but red dust and the smell of a valley gone wrong, their bare feet swaying inches above ground that had once been somebody's front yard. A crude board hung, nailed across the gate itself, the letters burned in with a hot iron. "This is Morrow's land." Silas Ward had ridden 2 days to reach this cabin, expecting an empty house and a patch of weeds. What he found instead stole the breath clean out of his chest, until he saw it, a finger twitching, a breath, shallow and stubborn, refusing to quit. Somebody down there was still fighting to live, and in about 4 seconds, Silas Ward was going to have to decide whether he was willing to die alongside her for the privilege of cutting that rope. Ask yourself plainly, because every man in this valley already knew the answer, and it was exactly why none of them had ever reached for a blade. Would you cut that rope, knowing what Vaughn Morrow does to anyone who crosses him? This is Coldwater Valley, Wyoming territory, the autumn of 1879, and Silas Ward, a broke drifter with nothing left to his name but a horse, a rifle, and a dead man's cabin, was about to become the one thing Vaughn Morrow had never once had to fear. Stay with this story to the very end, because before it's finished you'll understand exactly why grown men in 3 counties used to lower their voices whenever they said his name, and why Silas himself had spent 4 years trying to make sure nobody ever said it again. Now, let's go back 3 days to the morning, before Silas Ward had ever laid eyes on that gate. The bank took the Ward Ranch on a gray Tuesday in September, and it took it the way banks take everything, with a signature and a smile and a man in a clean collar who never once looked Silas in the eye while he did it. The cattle went first, sold off at half their worth to cover a debt Silas's father had run up chasing a drought that never broke. Then the house went, then the land, then the name on the deed that had belonged to 3 generations of Wards before this one. Silas rode out of town with a bedroll, a Winchester, a Colt he'd carried since the war, and a grandfather's old homestead up along Coldwater Creek that the bank hadn't bothered to touch because nobody thought it was worth touching. It would be enough. A roof, a well, a place to stop moving for a while, and figure out what a man does with himself once everything he was building toward is gone. He remembered his father's hands the last time he saw them steady, not shaking with fever, not clutching a bottle, just resting flat on the kitchen table the night before the bankman's first visit. Silas had buried him in the spring, then spent the summer watching the herd get walked off the property 1 wagon load at a time, and by the time September rolled around, there was nothing left in the town of Coldwater proper that still felt like it belonged to a Ward. Folks on the street either looked away or looked at him with a pity he found harder to stomach than contempt would have been. He didn't blame them for it. A man who'd lost that much, that fast, made other men nervous, like failure itself might be catching. He was not an easy man to read, and he'd worked at it. 29 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd swung an axe and thrown a saddle every day of his life, with pale gray eyes that gave nothing away, and a stillness to him that unsettled folks before they could say why. He had a habit, from the war and from something after it, he never spoke of sitting where he could see the door, of counting exits in any room he walked into, of keeping that Colt cleaned and oiled and clothes, not out of vanity, but the way another man keeps a good pair of boots, because you never know the day you'll need to move fast. Most people who met Silas Ward took him for exactly what he looked like, a quiet, broke drifter with sad eyes and not much left to lose. Almost nobody in Coldwater Valley knew what he'd been before the ranch, before the war even finished chewing through him, and Silas had gone to considerable trouble to keep it that way. The trail up to his grandfather's cabin ran high along the ridge above the valley floor, climbing through stands of lodgepole pine gone gold and rust with the turning season, and Silas let his horse pick its own pace while his mind drifted somewhere between grief and a stubborn, useless kind of hope. He'd played in that cabin as a boy, fished the creek below it, buried a dog behind the woodshed when he was 9 years old, and cried harder than he ever had at his father's funeral. It was the one place left in the world that still belonged to him. The higher he climbed, the quieter the world got, until the only sound left was hoofbeats and wind combing through the pine needles overhead. He passed the old boundary marker his grandfather had set with his own hands 40 years back, a cairn of white stone stacked at the fork where the Wardland began, and felt something in his chest ease slightly at the sight of it, the first thing in weeks that hadn't been taken from him or sold out from under him. The creek ran loud with the last of the season's snowmelt somewhere below the trail, and for one stretch of maybe a mile, Silas allowed himself something close to peace. He came around the last bend in the trail, expecting weeds through the porch boards and dust an inch thick on the windowsills. What he found instead was a nightmare hanging from his own front gate. 6 women, no, 5, he corrected himself with a lurch in his stomach, 5 hanging and one that had gone still enough he almost missed the shallow rise and fall of her chest, swung from a crossbeam lashed between the gateposts, wrists bound above their heads, dresses torn at the shoulders and stained dark down the front. Bare feet dangling cold in the mountain air, their hair hung loose and matted across faces bruised purple where the ropes had bitten into soft throats. Nailed across the chest of the nearest one, a rough board scrawled in charcoal and burned deep with a running iron, read simply, "This is Morrow's land." Silas's horse screamed and reared beneath him, wheeling away from the smell of blood and death that clung to the gateposts like smoke that wouldn't clear. He fought the animal down with hands gone white on the reins, his own breath coming ragged and fast. He knew the name Morrow. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name Morrow, from the saloon keep in town who wouldn't say it above a whisper, to the stage driver who'd once warned Silas, half joking and half not, that a man crossed Von Morrow exactly once in his life. Now, the proof of it hung directly in front of the only home Silas Ward had left in the world. Whispers around Coldwater had it that at least 2 other homesteads had gone quiet these past months, families packed up in the dead of night, or simply gone missing altogether. Their claims folded quietly into Morrow's growing empire before anyone thought to ask too many questions. Silas had heard those whispers same as everyone else, and dismissed them, the way a broke man dismisses plenty of things, deciding it wasn't his business to go looking for trouble he couldn't afford. Standing now in front of 6 women left to die on his own family's gate, that particular lie collapsed all at once, and something considerably older and colder than caution rose up to take its place. It belonged to a dark-haired woman near the center of the row. Her chin dropped to her chest, a thin trickle of blood dried along one temple. For one long, terrible second, Silas thought his eyes were lying to him, that grief and shock had conjured movement where there was none. Then he saw it again, a small, involuntary curl of her fingers. the last stubborn signal of a body that had not yet agreed to die. Something in Silas Ward went cold and clear all at once, the way it used to go cold and clear in the war, right before the part of him that could think fast and feel nothing took over from the part of him that was afraid. He dropped from the saddle before he'd finished deciding to. His boots hit the frozen dirt hard. He knew exactly what cutting that rope would cost him. Von Morrow did not forgive trespass on his business, and rescuing 6 women he'd gone to the trouble of hanging on a gatepost was about as deep a trespass as a man could commit in this valley. If you're finding yourself pulled into Maribel and Silas's story already, this would be a good moment to become a channel member. Just tap the join button beside the channel name. It helps keep stories exactly like theirs coming to your screen every week. Silas drew the hunting knife from his belt and reached up toward the rope holding the dark-haired woman, his rough hand trembling despite the stillness he was fighting to hold on to. He knew what it meant, cutting that first rope. It meant declaring, in the only language Von Morrow understood, that Silas Ward intended to be a problem. The blade caught the last gray light of afternoon as it slashed downward, and the rope parted. The woman's body dropped into his arms, feather-light and shockingly cold, as though he'd pulled her straight out of a grave instead of down off a gate. A pulse fluttered, weak but steady at her throat. He laid her gently in the dirt and turned to the next, working fast, now cutting each woman free and dragging her clear of the swaying beam, laying them in a row along the frost-hardened ground while he checked each throat for a heartbeat and found, to his disbelieving relief, 5 living women lay in front of Silas Ward's grandfather's cabin, and the 6th pair of eyes, the dark-haired woman's, had opened and were watching him, with an expression he would spend a long while afterward trying to name. Not gratitude, not yet, something closer to disbelief that anyone had bothered. He carried them inside one by one, boots thudding across a porch gone soft with rot, through a door that groaned on hinges nobody had oiled in a decade. Inside, the cabin was exactly what he'd expected before he ever reached the gate. Dust thick over every surface, cobwebs strung heavy in the corners, 4 bare walls and a stone hearth cold as the season outside. It became, in the span of one desperate hour, a sanctuary for 6 lives that had come within a rope's width of never seeing another sunrise. Silas got a fire going in the hearth with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking, coaxing a flame up out of dry kindling until it threw a soft orange light across 5 exhausted faces and 1 pair of dark eyes still fixed, unblinking on him. They were not nameless women, and as the fire caught and the cabin's chill began to break, Silas started learning exactly who he'd bound himself to. The eldest introduced herself first, once she'd caught enough breath to speak. Dovey, Ashworth, silver-haired, her hands already moving to tend the others, before she'd tended herself, pressing a torn strip of cloth against a gash. Beside her, the youngest of the group lay curled, small against the wall, barely more than a girl, her breath coming in thin, frightened gasps. Sarah Whitlock, 17 years old and looking younger. One hand pressed flat against her own chest as though she could hold her heart in place by force of will alone. A tall woman with broad shoulders and a jaw set hard as granite had taken the worst of the beating by the look of the bruising along her ribs, yet there was an unmistakable strength radiating off her even now, a stillness like a fence post that refused to lean no matter how hard the wind blew. Ruth Calder gave Silas a single measuring look, the kind that weighed a man clean through in under a second, and stayed silent. Near the hearth, a red-haired woman with a split lip and a cut along her cheekbone managed something that was almost a smile despite everything, a spark of pure defiance flickering behind eyes gone glassy with pain and exhaustion. Constance Doyle, Connie, she corrected him before he'd even asked, had the look of a woman who intended to survive out of pure spite if nothing else worked. The quietest of them sat apart near the wall, arms wrapped tight around her own knees, watching the fire with eyes that seemed to be doing arithmetic nobody else in the room could see. Opal Fenwick did not offer her name until much later that night, and when she finally did, it came with something else entirely, something that would matter a great deal more than anyone in that cabin yet understood. 6 women, 6 different kinds of ruin, and not one of them had come to that gate quietly. Whatever Morrow's men might have told themselves while they tied the ropes. Silas understood that much just from the half hour it took to get water and warmth into each of them. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to be 6 frightened strangers, simply waiting on a man to save them a second time. And the dark-haired woman, the one whose twitching finger had saved 5 other lives along with her own, finally found her voice as Silas knelt to press a cup of water into her hands. Her fingers, cracked and trembling, closed around the tin cup, like it was the only solid thing left in her world. "Don't leave us behind." It was not a plea. The words landed in the cabin like a command, steady, despite the raw wreckage of her voice, despite the rope burn still purple around her throat. Silas met her eyes and gave a single small nod before he moved on to the next woman waiting on water. Her name, he would learn within the hour, was Maribel Cole. And something about those 4 words, not begging, simply refusing, had already lodged itself somewhere in Silas Ward that he suspected wasn't coming loose again. Night fell hard and early over Coldwater Valley, the temperature dropping fast once the sun dipped behind the ridge, and the fire in the old hearth became the only warmth for 6 strangers and the man who'd pulled them off a rope. Silas passed the last of his canteen water around a second time, then set a pot of beans and salt pork over the flame, more out of habit than appetite. None of them had eaten anything in longer than they cared to admit. It was Maribel who broke the silence properly, once the worst of the shaking had passed and the color had started creeping back into faces gone gray with cold and blood loss. The beans took longer to soften than Silas remembered, the fire fighting a losing battle against a wind that found every gap in the old chinking between the logs. And by the time the pot was ready, 2 of the women had already drifted into an exhausted half-sleep sitting upright against the wall. He portioned out what there was without being asked, more concerned with getting something warm into each of them than with his own share, and only Maribel seemed to notice he'd left his own bowl mostly untouched until the last of the others had eaten their fill. "You want to know what happened to us. It wasn't a question." She sat with her back straight against the wall, despite every reason her body had to slump, her dark eyes fixed on the fire, like she was reading the story out of the flames instead of her own memory. "You should. It's the only thing that'll keep you alive now that you've cut us down." Silas stayed quiet, only settling across from her with his Winchester resting easy across his knees, and waited. Maribel told it plain, without flourish, the way a person tells something they've already relived 100 times inside their own skull before they ever spoke it aloud. Vaughn Morrow had come into Coldwater Valley 8 years back, with money nobody asked too many questions about, and a hunger for land that had only grown since. He wanted the whole valley floor, every acre of grazing and every foot of creek frontage, and he had spent nearly a decade buying out, driving out, or simply erasing anyone foolish enough to stand between him? Maribel's husband, Thomas, had held a claim on 60 acres along the good water, land his own father had proved up on before Morrow ever rode into the territory. And he had refused 3 separate offers, each one lower than the last. Thomas Cole had been found dead at the bottom of his own well 2 months back. Morrow's men called it an accident. Nobody in the valley believed that for one single second, and nobody said so out loud, because saying so out loud was how the other 5 women in this cabin had ended up on a gatepost. Each of them had lost a husband, a father, or a brother to Morrow's outfit in the past year alone. Ruth's husband shot for cattle. He was never proven to have stolen. Dovey's son-in-law burned out along with his barn. When the widows and daughters left behind refused, one after another, to simply pack up and vanish the way Morrow expected them to, he had decided to make an example loud enough that no one in Coldwater Valley would ever again mistake his patience for weakness. "He had us dragged out to your grandfather's old gate specifically," Maribel said, her voice flat and hard as the frozen ground outside. "Said an abandoned homestead made a fitting monument. Said it'd remind anybody riding through exactly whose land they were on." Her jaw tightened. "He was wrong about one thing. Nobody's lived here in years. He didn't count on somebody riding home." Silas felt something settle into place behind his ribs, cold and certain. "He'll know by morning that somebody cut you down." "He'll know by morning," Maribel agreed, "and then he'll come see to it personally." She looked at him steadily across the firelight. "You understand that you cut that rope with your eyes open?" "I did." It was Opal who moved then, rising from her place near the wall and crossing the cabin floor with slow, deliberate steps, favoring one leg that had clearly taken a hard fall at some point in the last day's ordeal. She knelt in front of Silas and reached into the torn lining of her skirt hem, drawing out a folded bundle of paper, gone soft and creased from being carried against skin for who knew how many days. She laid it on the floorboards between them like she was setting down something that might still explode. "These are what he can't talk his way out of," she said quietly. "I've been carrying them since the night they came for us. I didn't know if I'd live long enough for it to matter that I kept them." Silas unfolded the bundle carefully. The handwriting inside was Morrow's own, crude in places, careless in others, the ink smudged where sweat or rain had touched the page, but unmistakably his. Letters to men Silas recognized as names on the county payroll, instructions, numbers, a payment dated 3 weeks back, made out to Sheriff Emmett Dade for services described only as keeping the peace along the exact stretch of creek where Thomas Cole had turned up dead. And beneath that, in Morrow's own hand, an order, unambiguous, undeniable, to see that the widows who wouldn't sell were made into a lesson the rest of the valley would. Silas had heard Sheriff Dade's name plenty of times since riding back into the territory, always spoken with the particular flatness folks used for a man they'd stopped expecting anything honest from years ago. Dade had worn the badge in Coldwater for 6 years, long enough to remember a time before Morrow's money started arriving regular in envelopes nobody in town ever saw delivered, and long enough that most everybody had simply learned to root around him rather than through him whenever real trouble came calling. Seeing the numbers written out plain in Morrow's own hand didn't shock Silas so much as it confirmed something the whole valley had already quietly decided was true. Silas's hands had gone very still. "It's enough to hang him," Opal agreed, "if it reaches a judge who isn't already bought, and if the person carrying it lives long enough to hand it over. She met his eyes. Sheriff Dade answers tomorrow. There's no law in this valley that isn't already his. There's a territorial marshal out of Fort Bridger, Silas said slowly. Gideon Cross. My grandfather used to say he was one of maybe 3 honest badges left in this whole territory. Then somebody has to reach him, Maribel said, before Morrow reaches us. Silas looked around the cabin at 6 women who 12 hours earlier had been left to die on a gate as a warning to anyone who dared stand up to Vaughn Morrow, and felt the last piece of some decision he hadn't fully realized he was making click quietly into place. He had ridden up this trail with nothing left to lose. He understood now that wasn't quite true anymore. Then somebody reaches him, he said. Startin' tomorrow. Ruth, silent for most of the evening, spoke up from her place against the wall, her rough voice carrying an edge of something almost like dry amusement despite the bruises still darkening along her jaw. You talk awful calm for a man who just told Vaughn Morrow to go to hell. I've had practice, Silas said, and something in the way he said it made Connie's eyebrows lift, made her study him a beat longer than the comment seemed to warrant. That, so, she said. Funny thing, my father used to tell a story back before Morrow's men ran him off that cliff, about a soldier out of the Cimarron country who broke up the Colby gang single-handed back around 74. Wasn't a posse could do it, wasn't the army could do it. One man walked into their camp at night and walked out. The only one still breathing, her eyes stayed on Silas a moment too long, never did hear what became of him after. Silas didn't answer that, and something in his stillness answered it anyway. Maribel, watching the exchange over the rim of her cup, filed the silence away without comment, the way a person files away a fact they intend to come back to later. The fire burned low through the small hours, while the cabin settled into an uneasy, watchful rest. Silas kept the first watch himself, seated near the door, with his rifle across his lap, listening to 6 women's breathing slowly even out into something like sleep, though he doubted any of them slept deeply. Around midnight, Maribel stirred and came to sit near him instead of returning to the floor by the hearth, wrapping a threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders against the cold seeping in through the gaps in the doorframe. You didn't have to do any of this, she said quietly, not quite a question. No, Silas agreed, I didn't. Then why? He considered the fire a long moment before he answered. I've watched a lot of people die for no reason I could ever make sense of. Figured the least I owed the world was to stop one death that had a reason attached. When the chance actually landed in front of me, he glanced at her. You had a reason. That finger twitching was about the best reason I ever saw. Something shifted in her face then, not quite a smile, but the ghost of what one might have looked like on a woman who hadn't spent the last 2 days convinced she was going to die on a rope. Most men would have ridden past. Told themselves it wasn't their business. Most men didn't lose everything they had 2 weeks ago, Silas said. Makes it easier to spend what's left on something that matters. She studied him in the firelight, her mismatched exhaustion and stubborn will both plain on her face at once. What's your name again? Properly. Not just the man who cut the rope. Silas Ward? She held out her hand, formal as any parlor introduction despite the rope burn still raw around her wrist, and he took it careful and gentle. The way he'd have handled something he already understood was more valuable than it looked. I intend to remember it, she said, whatever happens next. Dawn came up, gray and cold over Coldwater Valley, mist pooling thick along the creek bottom below the cabin, and for one brief morning, it seemed almost possible to believe the previous day had been some kind of fever dream. Silas stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee and found the world quiet bird song drifting up from the pines, frost silvering the grass in the yard where 6 women had so recently been left for dead. He allowed himself exactly that one quiet morning before he set about the work of preparing for what he knew, with total certainty, was coming. He rode out at first light for the Tillman place, the nearest neighboring homestead a hard 2 hours down the valley, where Ezra Tillman, a weathered rancher who'd known Silas's grandfather 40 years and had taught Silas himself to rope a calf before he could properly walk, met him at the gate with a shotgun half raised out of pure habit before he recognized who was riding up. Silas laid it out fast and plain. 6 women alive, Morrow's crimes documented in his own handwriting, and a fuse already lit that neither of them had much time left to diffuse. Ezra's face had gone hard and pale by the time Silas finished talking. "Marshal Cross keeps an office out of Fort Bridger," he said. 2 days' hard ride, maybe less if the weather holds. He looked toward the barn, where a lean young ranch hand was forking hay with more energy than sense. "Jubal can ride like the devil's chasing him, and God knows he'll need to be. I'll send him with the letters myself, under my own name, so if Morrow's men catch wind of it, it's my neck in the noose and not one more of yours. I can't ask that of you." "You didn't ask," Ezra said. "I'm offering. I've watched that son of a Morrow bleed this valley dry for 8 years and told myself somebody else would eventually do something about it. Looks like somebody finally did." He clasped Silas's hand hard. "Get back to that cabin and keep those women breathing. Jubal rides within the hour." Silas thanked him plain and turned his horse back toward the ridge, the weight of everything still ahead of him settling heavy across his shoulders with every mile. Stories like this one keep going because members choose to support the channel. Tap join beside the channel name if you want more of them delivered straight to you. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than the ride out had, every mile freighted with the knowledge that Morrow's men were somewhere out there too, combing the valley for the 6 women who were supposed to be hanging silent and dead on a gatepost by now. Silas crested the last ridge above his grandfather's homestead just as the afternoon light started slanting gold through the pines, and for one heart-stopping second he thought he'd already lost the race. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, and figures moved in the yard, and it took a long, breathless moment before he recognized the shapes as Duvey hanging washed cloth to dry, and Ruth splitting, kindling with an axe held like she'd done the work her whole life. The cabin still stood. That peace held for 3 more days, and Silas spent every hour of it preparing for the moment it would end. He mended the door's hinges and reinforced it with a heavier crossbar. He counted his ammunition twice and found it wanting, so he traded 2 of his grandfather's old tools at the Tillman place for another box of rifle cartridges and a second Colt. He taught Sarah, hand shaking, how to hold a pistol steady enough to hit a fence post at 20 paces, and watched something like resolve settle into her frightened young face as she managed it on the 4th try. Maribel worked beside him through most of it, quiet and capable. The kind of quiet that came from a woman used to running a household and a ranch, both, and more than once Silas caught himself watching her a beat too long. Evenings, once the day's work wound down, the 7 of them gathered around the hearth in a rough approximation of the family, none of them had asked to become. Duvy taught Sarah to properly wrap a wound so it wouldn't fester, working by firelight with strips torn from an old shirt. Connie kept up a running commentary on Silas's cooking that had Ruth laughing despite herself more than once, a low, rusty sound like she hadn't used it much lately and was surprised to find it still worked. Opal spent the quiet hours recopying the letters twice over in a careful, patient hand, certain a single set of proof was one accident away from vanishing for good. Maribel watched all of it with an expression Silas couldn't quite read, something between grief for the life these women had lost and a fierce protective satisfaction at watching them find their footing again anyway. That third evening, after the others had settled for the night, Maribel found Silas out on the porch, checking his rifle by lantern light for what had to be the third time that day. She sat beside him without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them spoke. If this goes the way I think it might, I don't much want to go back to a life that looks like it did before. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dark tree line rather than on him. Silas turned that over in his mind. Don't reckon any of us get to go back to exactly what we had. Question's just what we build instead. She considered that a long moment, then let her hand rest lightly over his on the rifle stock, and neither of them moved to pull away. On the evening of the third day, the mule tied out behind the cabin let out a shrill, panicked bray, ears pinned flat toward the trail below. Silas set down the harness leather he'd been mending and went still, every old instinct from the war rising up cold and immediate under his skin. Then he heard it, the low, distant rumble of many horses moving together, still far off but coming on steady, growing louder with every passing second. Inside the cabin, Ruth was on her feet before Silas had finished crossing the yard, her face set hard as stone. "He knows," she said. "Morrow knows we're alive." Connie's jaw clenched tight enough to whiten. "We don't have many choices left tonight. We can die in this cabin, or we can make it cost him more than he's willing to pay." Silas moved through the room without ceremony, hauling his grandfather's old gun chest out from beneath the floorboards where he'd hidden it days earlier, 2 spare rifles, a box of shells, the second Colt he'd traded for, an old dueling pistol that had belonged to his great-uncle. He handed them out, one at a time, matching weapon to woman with a care that left no room for argument. Connie took the second Colt, her hands steadier now than they'd been 3 nights ago, eyes gone flat and businesslike. Ruth wrapped her fingers around the knife's worn handle, like she intended to use it exactly the way it was built for. Duvy accepted the older of the 2 rifles without a word, checking its action with the calm efficiency of a woman who had clearly handled a gun before, sometime long before this valley had ever heard the name Morrow. Opal took the dueling pistol, turning it once in her hand before tucking it into her waistband. Sarah's fingers trembled around the pistol Silas pressed into them, but she held onto it anyway, and that, Silas thought, was the whole of courage, not the absence of shaking hands but keeping hold. Maribel took the last rifle, checked the load herself without being asked, and met Silas's eyes across the cabin. "You didn't save us so we could stand behind you and watch," she said. "We fight. I was counting on it," Silas said. The hoofbeats grew from rumor to certainty within minutes, shaking the ground outside hard enough to rattle the cabin's few remaining window panes. And then torchlight bloomed orange against the tree line, spreading fast as more than 24 riders broke from the tree cover. At the center of them, sitting tall and easy atop a black horse, like a man who had never once in his life been told no. Vaughn Morrow raised a gloved hand and brought his outfit to a halt 50 yards out. His voice cracked across the yard like a judge reading sentence. "You've got something of mine in that cabin. Hand them over and I'll consider letting you keep your life, since you're too new to this valley to know better." Silas stepped out onto the porch, Winchester held loose and ready in both hands, his voice carrying flat and clear across the frost-hardened yard. "This is my grandfather's land, Morrow. His blood's in this dirt, same as anybody's. Those women aren't yours, and they aren't leaving." Laughter rippled through Morrow's riders, ugly and confident. Then a single shot cracked out of the dark, splintering the porch post inches from Silas's shoulder, and the laughter died, all at once, into something far more purposeful. The siege of the Ward homestead began in earnest with that single gunshot, and within seconds the whole yard erupted into chaos. Muzzle flashes strobing bright against the gathering dark, glass shattering somewhere behind Silas. He dropped low and returned 3 shots through the gap in the doorframe, and somewhere out past the porch rail a man cried out and went silent. Inside the cabin, Ruth met a rider who'd forced his way half through the shattered window with the flat of her knife driven hard into his forearm, and the man screamed and fell backward into the yard, clutching a wound that would trouble him considerably longer than tonight. Connie fired twice through the gap where the door hung slightly ajar, dropping a man scrambling toward the porch with a torch raised high, the flame guttering out in the mud beside him. Sarah's hands shook as badly as anyone expected, but when a shadow lunged through the broken window at her, she didn't freeze. She fired, wide and desperate, and the shot went close enough to send the man reeling back out into the dark, cursing loud enough to be heard over the gunfire. Duvey loaded and fired the old rifle with a steady, grim patience that belied every one of her 60-some years, and a rider toppled from his saddle at the edge of the yard, his horse bolting, riderless, into the trees. Opal crouched near the hearth, the dueling pistol gripped in both hands, and put a single careful shot through the shoulder of a man trying to work the crossbar loose from outside, sending him stumbling away with a howl. Morrow cracked a whip somewhere out in the chaos, screaming for his men to press the attack, and a lit torch arced high through the darkness to land against the cabin's shingled roof. Smoke began curling thick and acrid through the rafters within minutes, the whole structure groaning under the growing heat, like something alive and afraid. Silas dropped to one knee on the porch, reloading with fingers gone numb and clumsy, and felt the hot punch of a bullet grazing across his shoulder a half-second before the pain caught up with the shock of it. Blood soaked, warm and fast, through his shirt. He kept firing anyway, 3 rounds left, then 2. A second wave of riders pressed in from the north side of the yard, testing the woodshed wall where the timber ran thinnest, and for a handful of seconds it seemed the whole line might simply collapse inward. Dobie put her last rifle round through the gap in the shed door and bought them another minute. Sarah, out of pistol shot, snatched up a fallen man's revolver from just outside the window and kept firing with hands that had stopped shaking entirely somewhere in the last 10 minutes. Whatever fear she'd carried into this fight apparently burned clean away by the sheer need to survive it. Maribel came through the smoke behind him, firing twice past his shoulder at a shape moving along the tree line, then hauling him upright by the collar of his coat when his knees buckled. Her eyes blazed in the firelight, dark and utterly unafraid despite the chaos closing in around them, and for one strange, suspended second in the middle of a gunfight, Silas found himself thinking that he had never in his life seen anyone look more alive. "You're not dying on this porch," she said, close enough that he felt the words as much as heard them. "Not after everything it cost you to get us this far." Morrow's voice rose above the gunfire and the crackling roof, dripping with contempt. "You're nothing but insects, the lot of you. By morning this valley remembers exactly who holds the power here." Ammunition was running perilously low throughout the cabin. The walls riddled with bullet holes, smoke thickening the air until every breath came ragged and burning. Silas dropped to one knee again, 3 rounds left in the Winchester, sweat and blood mixing on his face, his vision swimming at the edges. Around him 6 women stood their ground regardless, none of them flinching, and for one long terrible moment it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see whether courage alone was going to be enough. Then, cutting through the chaos, came the sound of a rifle shot fired straight up into the night sky, a signal shot, sharp and deliberate. Nothing like the wild gunfire tearing through the yard. A second later, the ground itself began to tremble with the weight of many more horses coming on hard and fast from the direction of the valley road. Ezra Tillman crested the ridge first, a shotgun braced across his saddle and a dozen neighboring homesteaders riding hard behind him, men and women alike, who had buried husbands and sons to Von Morrow's outfit over 8 long years and had finally, all at once. Behind them came a tight column of deputized riders under a lean, gray-mustached man wearing a territorial marshal's star, pinned bright against his coat. Gideon Cross, who had ridden 2 days near, without stopping once Jubal reached him with Morrow's own letters clutched in a saddlebag, and who had not wasted a single hour once he'd read what those letters contained. The posse struck Morrow's flank like a wave breaking over a seawall, scattering riders who had come expecting an easy massacre and found themselves instead caught between a burning cabin they couldn't take. One of Morrow's men, wheeling his horse in panic, caught sight of Silas standing bloodied but upright on the porch through the smoke and went pale as a sheet, his voice cracking out over the chaos. That's the man from Cimarron Pass. The name rippled through what remained of Morrow's outfit like a physical blow. Men who had ridden into this fight expecting a broke nobody and a handful of terrified women, suddenly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the fight they were in. Silas Ward had buried that name 4 years ago, along with everything else the war had cost him, convinced it belonged to a man who no longer existed. Standing on his grandfather's porch, with a rifle in his bloodied hands, and Von Morrow's outfit breaking apart in panic around him, he understood there was no burying it any longer. It had been 4 winters since Cimarron Pass, since a younger, harder version of Silas Ward had ridden alone into an outlaw camp that outnumbered him 20 to 1 and walked back out having ended every threat that camp. He'd convinced himself afterward that ending that many lives in one night, however justified, had cost him something he didn't want to spend the rest of his years paying interest on. So he'd buried the name along with the uniform and ridden west, hoping distance alone might let him become somebody quieter. Standing on his grandfather's porch 4 years later, with that same cold clarity settling back over him like an old coat that still fit exactly right, Silas understood that a man could bury a name, but he couldn't always bury what the name was built out of. Morrow himself, seeing his line collapse and Ezra Tillman's posse closing fast alongside the marshal's riders, wheeled his black horse hard toward the tree line in an attempt to run. He made it perhaps 30 yards before Gideon Cross put himself directly in Morrow's path, a leveled rifle leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, and Von Morrow, the man who had never once in his life been told no, found himself hauled bodily off his horse and thrown face first into the frost-hardened dirt of the very yard he'd meant to burn. If you want more stories about quiet strangers turning out to be exactly the man a tyrant should have feared, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. The battle ended as the first gray light of morning broke over the ridgeland, smoke still curling black from the scorched half of the cabin's roof, the yard littered with the wreckage of the fight that had nearly ended everything. Von Morrow knelt in the dirt at the center of a circle of grim-faced homesteaders and deputized riders, his hands bound tight behind his back, his fine coat torn and filthy, the arrogance that had carried him through 8 years of terrorizing this valley finally, completely gone from his face. Opal stepped forward with a bundle of letters clutched in both hands, the same bundle she'd carried hidden against her own skin through 2 days of captivity and a night of gunfire, and laid them at Marshal Cross's feet without a word. The marshal crouched and read through them slowly in the pale morning light, his expression darkening with every page. The payments to Sheriff Dade, the orders naming each widow specifically, the unmistakable signature at the bottom of every damning line. They're forgeries, Morrow spat, his voice cracking with a desperation that fooled no one. Lies. Burn them before you let some drifter's whore convince you. That's your hand, Morrow. Maribel's voice cut across the yard cold and clear, carrying the weight of a woman who had buried a husband because of exactly the crimes now spread across the marshal's palms. I watched you sign worse than this. You put my Thomas in the ground, and you hung 6 women on a gate to make sure nobody else in this valley ever crossed you again. Today somebody finally does. Marshal Cross rose, folding the letters carefully into his coat, and regarded Morrow with the flat, unhurried contempt of a man who had waited a long while for a case this solid to finally land on his desk. Sheriff Dade will answer for his part in Fort Bridger, same as you'll answer for yours. Every name in these letters is going to face a judge who isn't drawing a wage from your pocket, Morrow. I'll see to that personally. He nodded to 2 of his riders who hauled Morrow up and marched him toward a waiting horse, his protests fading into the general noise of a valley, finally, cautiously beginning to breathe out. Ward reached Fort Bridger within the week that Sheriff Emmett Dade had been relieved of his badge and his liberty, both, the letters bearing his name, enough on their own to end a career that had quietly rotted out from the inside for longer than anyone. He did not go quietly by every account, though nobody in the valley found themselves losing much sleep over that particular fact. Silas stood near the shattered porch rail through all of it, blood dried dark along his shoulder, watching the man who had terrorized this valley for 8 years get dragged away in disgrace by the one honest lawman left in the territory. Ezra Tillman clapped a hand against his good shoulder, grinning through a face streaked with soot and gunpowder. "Told you Marshal Cross was worth the ride," he said. "Whole valley owes you a debt tonight, son. Your grandfather would have been proud past words." News of Von Morrow's fall spread through Coldwater Valley faster than any wildfire could have managed on its own, carried homestead to homestead by riders eager to be the ones delivering it. Families who had spent years paying protection money without ever calling it that rode out to the Ward place over the following days, bringing what they could spare, a side of bacon, a coil of good rope, a jar of preserves put up the autumn before, but as the kind of thanks a valley offers when it finally remembers what it feels like to breathe without looking over its shoulder. Silas found himself, for the first time since the bank had taken his family's ranch, on the receiving end of a community's gratitude instead of its pity, and he was honestly not sure which one sat stranger in his chest. It took 3 days to make the cabin whole again. New shingles laid over the burned half of the roof, the shattered window boarded and reglazed, the blood-stained porch boards pried up and replaced plank by plank, until barely a trace remained of the night the whole valley had nearly lost 6 women to Von Morrow's cruelty. All 6 of them stayed to help with the rebuilding, rather than scatter back to homesteads that mostly no longer existed, Ruth hauling lumber with the same steady strength she'd shown in the fight, Sarah planting a row of winter vegetables along the south wall, with hands that no longer shook when she held a spade, Duvy taking over the kitchen like she'd run it her whole life, Connie mending fences and cracking dry jokes that got everyone laughing despite everything, Opal quietly copying out fair transcripts of the letters to be sent along to the territorial court. Maribel worked beside Silas through most of it, and somewhere in the space of those 3 long days hauling timber, splitting shingles, standing together at dusk to watch the new gate go up where the old crossbeam had once held something far darker, the careful distance between them had quietly, entirely disappeared. The other 5 women had begun slowly to imagine lives beyond the cabin's walls, Ruth talking of filing her own claim a few miles downstream, where good grazing still sat unclaimed, Connie threatening cheerfully to open a proper boarding house in whatever town would have her, hopeful letters to a cousin back east who might take her in for the winter school term, Duvy declaring flatly that she intended to stay exactly where she was for as long as anyone would let her cook for them. Opal alone stayed quiet on the subject of her own future, though more than once Silas noticed her watching the valley road below, with an expression that looked less like fear now, and more like a woman finally allowing herself to imagine what came next. On the evening the last board went into place, Silas stood back to look at the finished gate, plain and sturdy, and carrying nothing on it now but the smell of fresh-cut pine. "No sign this time," Maribel said, coming to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. "Just a gate, just a gate," Silas agreed. He glanced at her, something unguarded showing plain on his face, for maybe the first time since she'd met him. "I came up this trail 3 weeks ago, thinking I'd lost everything a man could lose, and now I'm not sure I know how to explain what I found." Instead, he reached for her hand and she let him take it, her fingers curling into his without hesitation. "Reckon I've got some time to figure out the words for it, though." "Doesn't seem like you're planning on going anywhere." "No," Maribel said, low and certain, watching the last of the sunset burn gold and orange over the ridgeline that had so nearly become their grave. Behind them, on the cabin porch, Dovey caught Ruth's eye and said nothing at all, only smiled the small, satisfied smile of a woman who had watched enough of the world's cruelty to recognize the rare moment when it finally balanced back out in somebody's favor. Connie, predictably, was the one who broke the quiet with a low laugh and a comment about somebody finally working up the nerve, and even Sarah managed a real unguarded smile at that, the first Silas had seen from her since the night he'd cut her down off that gate. Out here in Coldwater Valley, land could change hands a dozen ways: bought, stolen, bled, buried under. But justice, when it finally arrived, belonged only to the people willing to stand together long enough to earn it, and family, Silas Ward had learned the hard way, was never really about blood at all. Sometimes it was about a rope, a knife, and the 4 seconds it took one broke, quiet drifter, to decide that a stranger's life was worth more than his own safety. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, hit that subscribe button and stay close. There's another tale from the Wild West waiting for you soon, and, trust me, it's one you won't want to miss.